Good afternoon and welcome back. Kindly note that we have distributed feedback form for all the sessions of today. Kindly fill them and leave them on your seats. We'll collect them. Now, I would like to invite our distinguished speakers, Mr. Mateo Ferrero and Mr. Erik, to proceed the session. So, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a nice, enjoyable first day yesterday. We certainly enjoyed ourselves, and we were already commenting with Erik how much we are already learning from your experience, from your questions. So let's try to keep the sessions interactive. Feel free to raise your hand and interrupt at any moment if you have a question, a query, if we're going too fast. So by all means, let's keep the discussion going. So we thought we could start today with one presentation that is aiming at going a bit deeper with respect to these TBT principles, the famous 5 principles that we saw yesterday, a little bit on the surface. The idea now is to maybe go a bit deeper with respect to a few of those principles by relying on a few cases that have come up before the WTO dispute settlement system. So, to get started, we're going to start with one case known as US tuna. It was a dispute that Mexico brought against the United States approximately 10 years ago. And it's a very interesting dispute on many levels, but on the one hand, it's a dispute that will allow us to understand much better the difference between technical regulations and standards with respect to the issue of I think maybe it was too much for the session, huh?
You can continue like that.
I know Luciano about the case to understand in reality the non-discrimination obligation. So that's one reason why we will start with that case. The other reason is that it's a very important seminal environmental dispute that will also allow us to understand how the protection of the environment is related to technical regulations and how WTO adjudicators have dealt with those difficult questions when they have to balance the legitimate objective pursued by a member, in this case the protection of the environment, against potential trade restrictions being caused by a measure, in this case by a technical regulation. So maybe while the system comes back, let me start with a little background, and it's background with respect to the facts of the case. So we will have some nice slides when they're back that will show how this was a case basically related to tuna, but it was also a case related to dolphins. Now, why is that the case? Because for some reason, I'm no scientific myself, but for some reason, there is a phenomenon called the Tuna Dolphin Association, whereby dolphins and schools of tuna tend to swim together. So, of course, the tuna would swim underneath, and then the dolphins would be closer to the surface. And this phenomenon of tuna-dolphin association is particularly strong in certain parts of the ocean. In particular, it is very, very dominant in the eastern tropical Pacific, which is, this is why it's always good to have two people. Thank you, Erik. Just in case. That's perfect. So this phenomenon is quite strong in the eastern tropical Pacific, and we will see a nice map so that you can visualize it more clearly, but just to start conceptualizing it. This is an area in the ocean west of the United States coast, west of Mexico, and then going perhaps all the way down to Peru. In that area of the ocean, this tuna-dolphin association phenomenon is very, very strong. And then why am I starting with that? Because, of course, you know, fishermen took good notice of this phenomenon, and they realized that finding dolphins could help them find the precious tuna, in particular the precious yellowfin tuna. So during the 50s and 60s, they developed a fishing technique called setting on dolphins. And we will see some slides so that you can also visualize that. But basically, setting on dolphins is a fishing technique whereby the fishermen use speedboats to track dolphins. Once they've tracked the dolphins, they encircle them with the speedboats. And once they are encircled, they throw what's called a purse seine net, which is basically like a purse. And once it actually goes all the way down, they start catching everything that's underneath. And of course, the goal for them is to get the beautiful, precious yellowfin tuna, but unfortunately, the fishing technique also has strong environmental impacts in the sense that there is significant bycatch. And in this particular case, there was significant bycatch of dolphins. So this was a technique used in the 60s, in the 70s for a while, until some environmental groups in the United States, NGOs, realized that this was going on. And somebody even went undercover in a boat, pretending just to be another fisherman, but did a recording of the process and did a recording of the environmental effects, and particularly the environmental effects on dolphins. And this became a documentary, a very poignant, important documentary in the US in the 70s that led to a very important environmental movement to regulate and potentially even ban this practice. Because it was not only, just causing lots of dolphins to die, it was a very, very high number of dolphins. So I think now the figures slip, but it was something as high as maybe 1 million dolphins a year were dying as bycatch due to this practice. So then, in the late 70s, the US started to basically outlaw this practice, and at first they came up with a ban on tuna that was fished by setting on dolphins, and that actually led to a dispute before the GATT in the WTO's predecessor. And that dispute was a very controversial dispute. I think it saw the light of day in the early 90s, and because it was controversial due to the whole environmental issues being discussed, the United States blocked the adoption of that dispute in the GATT. And the GATT, and I mean, this is maybe telling a story a bit the long way, but during the GATT era, dispute settlement reports were not automatically legally binding. Back, okay, fantastic. So I can hopefully now show you before getting into so before getting into the nitty-gritty of the dispute and all all the legal aspects. Let's go together just so that you see visually.
Thank you very much. So just that you see visually what I'm talking about. So this is an attempt at doing a visual representation of the Tuna Dolphin Association. So you see dolphins swimming on the surface, tuna swimming underneath. Then this is the area of the ocean where the phenomenon is particularly right, so very in the coast adjacent to California, to Mexico, to Central America, and the north of South America. That's where this phenomenon is particularly strong. And that's the area of the ocean where millions of dolphins a year were dying or being seriously harmed as a result of this fishing technique of setting on dolphins. Now, this was the area of the ocean where the concern arose. But I think at this point it's also important to say that, of course, in other parts of the ocean, there is also a concern about dolphin mortality and serious injuries in relation to the fishing practices related to tuna fishing. But in this area of the ocean, the phenomenon is particularly strong, and therefore the fishing practices, were particularly strong. Now, there is basically a photo of the technique being deployed. So you can see how the dolphins are encircled, and then the purse scene is then deployed. And then, of course, you can imagine it all comes out, and there is significant bycatch. This, I have forgotten to mention this, but this is very important. So basically, there were 3 types of negative effects on dolphins as a result of this technique. So, of course, on the top left, there is the first one, which is the most evident one, which is basically death, because they're trapped and they die, or serious injury, and therefore eventually they will die, the dolphins. But and those were the so-called observable effects of the fishing technique of setting on dolphins. But there were also other unobservable effects of setting on dolphins. In particular, there was the separation of mothers and calves. So you couldn't really tell that a dolphin had died, because that's not exactly what happened during the fishing technique. But if they are separated, of course, eventually the calf would not be able to survive. So that's one unobservable effect. The second one is all of this chasing of the dolphins with the speedboats, of course, caused in them a lot of stress. And scientists realized that this was leading to reduced reproduction within the dolphin populations. So that was another unobservable effect. So because of all of these, the US government, as a result of these environmental campaigns that I was mentioning, decided to first outlaw the practice. So tuna caught by setting on dolphins was banned, and this led to this famous GATT case that was controversial, and therefore the report itself never became legally binding. And then maybe, I guess something I forgot when I was showing this image, the map. So here, I guess, of course, there was a significant, a major US fishing fleet operating in this area and using this fishing technique. And then, of course, there were the fishing fleets of other countries, in particular Mexico, that were also using this fishing technique. So there were the fishing fleets of several countries doing the same technique. When the environmental movements start becoming so important, I guess it's not meant to be. We'll go actually like this. It's actually better. So when the environmental movements started taking force in the US, then
the US fishing fleet felt the need to move on, to actually evolve from that practice of setting on dolphins. And they developed other techniques that did not have the same environmental impacts on dolphins. It was in a sense an evolution that took years, but it was done. So as a result, by the 90s and the early 2000s, the majority of the US fishing fleet was not setting on dolphins, and therefore these environmental impacts decreased significantly. But the same is not true in terms of the Mexican fishing fleet. The Mexican fishing fleet decided to take another strategy. They decided to stick with that technique because it was maybe very effective, and seeing that this was potentially becoming a trade barrier in terms of exporting tuna products
to the US, thank you so much, they realized that they needed to engage with the US and find a common solution, something that would eventually work for their industry. And what they decided was, they decided to start negotiations to develop a labeling regime. Thank you. They decided to start negotiations to develop a labeling regime that would indicate whether a tuna product could be considered dolphin safe, and the US engaged with them on that process. So as a result of that, eventually there was a labeling program that allowed labeling tuna products as dolphin safe within this international program, even if the practice of setting on dolphins was used. The sole requirement for obtaining the label was the need to show that there had been no dolphin mortality or no serious injuries on dolphins. So that's the international regional labeling program that Mexico, the US, and other countries in the region negotiated in the 90s. But unfortunately for the Mexicans, in the US, the environmental movement was still putting a lot of pressure on government. And they considered that regime to be insufficient. So they pressed the US government to develop its own labeling regime, and we will see in detail the features of that labeling regime, but they pressured them so that they would develop a dolphin-safe labeling regime in which there would need to be a showing not only of no mortality and no serious injuries, but also of no setting on dolphins. So maybe just to recap, under the regional international labeling regime, you could obtain a dolphin-safe label simply by showing that there had been no mortality and no serious injury. But under the US labeling regime, you would need to show no mortality and no serious injury and no setting on dolphins. So that's the way it all evolved. And as I was telling you, the US fishing fleet evolved these practices and turned to other methods and maybe potentially other areas of the ocean, but the Mexican fishing fleet stuck to this particular area of the ocean and to the fishing method of setting on dolphins. So then in around 2010, Mexico brought a dispute against a WTO panel complaining about the US labeling regime for dolphin-safe tuna products. And as I was saying at the beginning, this is a dispute that is very interesting for understanding a bit better the differences between technical regulation and standards, and also non-discrimination issues. So let's start with that first question of whether the measure was a technical regulation or a standard. So you may recall yesterday from our discussion this mantra we repeated several times, that technical regulations are mandatory, standards are voluntary. So far so good, right? But take a look at the screen where you see that for purposes of the TBT agreement, both technical regulations and standards, and this is the second sentence there, a bit in bold, may also include or deal exclusively with terminology, symbols, packaging, marking, or labeling requirements as they apply to a product, process, or production method. And both sentences are identical. So keep that in mind as we then now take a look at the measure at issue. So, as I was telling you, then there was this labeling regime created in the US due to all this pressure from environmental groups. And you can see the label there on the left. According to that label, basically that label established the conditions for the use of the dolphin safe label, which could be that one, or maybe even other labels that related to the dolphin safety of tuna products. It was not an exclusive label, that one over there on the left. You could also use others, other designs, other dolphins jumping, maybe even a little face with flipper, whatever you wanted. But the conditions for obtaining that label were the ones established in the DPCIA, the Dolphin Protection and Conservation Act. Importantly, the use of a dolphin safe label was not required for purposes of selling tuna products or importing tuna products. It was not required to actually use a dolphin safe label. It was almost left to the consumers to choose which tuna products they wanted. And then remember, in terms of the actual requirements, the two key elements: no dolphin mortality and serious injury, and no setting on dolphins. And then finally, and this is absolutely key, that legislation prohibited any reference to dolphins or other marine mammals, porpoises, etc., on any label for any tuna products unless the conditions for obtaining the label were met. In other words, if a tuna product was caught by setting on dolphins, you would not be able to use the dolphin safe label. Now, that's a bit of a long explanation, but I think it can lead to an interesting question now. Remember, the label is not mandatory. I'll give you the floor in a moment. The label is not necessary to import or sell tuna products. So it's, in a way, left to the market. But any dolphin safe label that is used must comply with these conditions: no mortality, no injury, and no setting on dolphins. So, as you may imagine, Mexico, when they brought their case, they challenged this as being a technical regulation. So remember what we just saw. Why? Because it's a labeling requirement applied to a product, process, or production method, and they are mandatory. Now, you may guess what was the US rebuttal argument? No. This is not a technical regulation. This is a standard. You do not need to use a dolphin safe label to import or sell tuna products in the United States. So think about that for a minute, because I would like to hear your views as to where you would come out. And then maybe now, I think there was a question from the colleague here. I'll give you the floor.
You just said that dolphin's safe label was used just for the production purposes and selling in the market. However, it was not a regulation on the consumers. Consumers were free to buy whatever they would choose to. But then how would the market evolve? In this, consumer would have definitely bought something which is little less pricier, because as I expect, since it is being tagged as dolphin safe, it would have been little costlier than the non-branded ones, I would say. So the demand of non-branded ones might be a little more because of the cost differences.
I think that's a good point. I mean, it shows a bit the possible consequences of labeling regimes on market conditions, because of course, indeed, in order to obtain a dolphin safe label, you would need to comply with certain requirements. In particular, you would need to have an independent observer on the boat, and you would need to then obtain a certification, etc., etc. So of course, this would add up costs. Now, I don't remember exactly how this translated into prices on the market, but what I do remember is that Mexico was arguing that in the US there is very strong demand for tuna products that are dolphin safe because of this big environmental movement in the 70s and the 80s. So potentially the demand could have been so strong that maybe it would override maybe price considerations. But thank you for the question. I think there is maybe another one there.
Good morning. I'm from the Marine Products Export. One is the upcoming Marine Mammal Conservation Act, Protection Act, MMPA. So this is going to be implemented from 2014 January only. Sorry, 24 January 1st onwards. 2024 January 1st. That tells that marine mammals, including dolphins, should not be injured or killed during the met operation. So that is going to be implemented from 2024 January. And it comes to around 2,500 crores worth exports to US. And US is the first number one market for Indian marine products.
Thank you. This is super interesting. And so hopefully the discussion in a few slides down could maybe shed some light on the types of issues that should be considered when designing this type of measure, and also maybe possible things to keep in mind in terms of complying. Maybe we can even go towards that at the end, or maybe bilaterally, but there was an action simply by, so that you are fully aware, there was actually one of the early cases in the WTO was also a dispute about shrimp and turtles being caught in nets when fishing for shrimp. And maybe to tell a long story short, the WTO appellate body ruled that the US was able to indeed impose requirements that would be set in place in order to protect turtles and turtle populations, but they could not impose a single uniform unbending requirement. In other words, the US needed to have a law that would be open to other methods that could also be used to protect turtles as long as they were equally efficient. And as a result of that, ruling, the US had to change its law so that they could accept methods used in other countries if they were effective in protecting turtles. But we can maybe discuss about that in more detail if that's of interest to you. Thank you so much. So maybe let's go back to this question. In your view, a measure like what we saw, is it a technical regulation because it's mandatory, or is it a standard because it's voluntary? I don't know if there are any views already being formed on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to mention, this is quite a tricky question here, but it's very important because if it is mandatory, it is a technical regulation and it triggers all the requirements of the TBT agreement. So here the US, as Mateo was saying, is arguing that it's voluntary. So do they have a point, is the question. In a way you can draw a parallel to organic agriculture or tea exports that are being organic. You can always export tea, you can always do that, no one prevents you from doing so, but if you want to call it organic, you may have to follow certain standards to be able to do so. So for instance in the European Union, Japan, United States, they have notified technical regulations that say if you want to call something organic, you need to use the following codex or farm standards, and that becomes then a technical regulation. This is slightly different. It's kind of a different construct here. Because you can always sell tuna in the US, but if you want to say it's dolphin free, something is triggered. So that's what makes this a bit confusing.
Exactly. And maybe it's remember how when we were discussing yesterday about these principles, I was sort of foreshadowing that when you come to apply these principles to specific factual circumstances, there are many gray areas. So this is clearly one of those gray areas. I think maybe the gentleman here had a comment, a question.
In regard to that, labeling is not necessary, but when the label is indicating about dolphins, it becomes regulation. So that means if a label contains dolphins, then it becomes under the regulation. As long as you label without reference to dolphins, then it is a standard.
That's super interesting. So the US would come back and say, but you don't require a label to import or to sell tuna products in the US, so it's a standard. I don't know if somebody would have a comment with that, with respect to that. I have two hands here, maybe.
In my view, they will be catering to a certain set of market, niche market, and if you have to cater to that market, then you have to have that regulatory requirement. So it becomes a technical requirement, regulatory requirement for that, in my view. If you don't want to cater to that, then it's okay, it's just a standard. That's what is my view.
Sir, I have a slightly different view. From the environmental impact assessment, it is certainly a technical regulation. But if you, from the marketing point of view, it is a standard.
I think both those comments are very interesting because the way I understood them was it depends a bit on the lens you're using. So if you use one lens, it could be a technical regulation. If you use another lens, it can be a standard. And I think that's a very valid point of view. But now put yourselves in the shoes of a WTO adjudicator whose report is going to be examined across the world and highly criticized. So they have to think about giving a solution in which something can be seen as objective reasoning and where probably it's not easy to say it depends on your perspective. You have to say, is it a technical regulation or a standard? Because remember that the US was saying it's a standard, and Mexico had only brought claims that this was a technical regulation. So you couldn't say both, because that would have basically meant that Mexico's case would have been thrown out. Here.
I have a point to say, like, this is my view, because it is a standard and standard is voluntary in nature. So if somebody is adopting that standard, that is okay, then they have to fulfill the requirement as just to declare this SOP, like this label. But when it is regulation, which is imposed by Mexico, so it is a country specific requirement. So if somebody wants to sell this tuna product with this labeling, then they have to follow the standard, what standard says. But this is the requirement. So it is very much country specific. If you want to sell this dolphin with this label, you have to fulfill this requirement. But where it is not required, it is not mandated. So it is two ways, as you said, it is the lens view.
I'm glad that we are all equally confused, because this is indeed a tricky issue. So that's why it's good to have this discussion. I think maybe there was a gentleman there, well, actually two. One, two, and then three.
Sir, it is always safer to adjudicate as a technical regulation.
So you're saying it's maybe safer to classify this as a technical regulation?
Because our approach also to save the dolphins also.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's that's a good point of view. I hadn't thought of that. Maybe should we go to the back to the two gentlemen and then maybe afterwards we go there.
So what I would want to point out is that they say that it prohibits any reference to dolphin. So that means that they are impeding free trade because others who might in the other treaties which do allow a dolphin tag, so they cannot allow they cannot prohibit other tags which do reference to mammals.
That's indeed the key point, and maybe let's just go straight to that because, and then of course we can take the other two comments. But that's what the gentleman there just shared was exactly the key point that led the panel and the appellate body in that dispute to consider that the US dolphin safe labeling regime was a technical regulation. The appellate body found that that particular feature of the law that indicated that no label could refer to dolphins, to marine mammals, to purposes, etc., unless the conditions for the label were met, was what was the tipping point that made this measure going from a standard to a technical regulation. In other words, think about standards and the nice discussion we had earlier in the morning. Normally standards, as they were saying, they're voluntary. As an industry participant, you may decide to go for standard A, or a standard B, or a standard C, and they may actually be potentially different, even contradictory. But as an industry participant, you can choose which one you go for. That feature in the DPCIA, which the gentleman pointed out, was what prevented that choice for industry. Because yes, you could use other labels other than the official US Department of Commerce labels, but in order to use any of those labels, you would need to demonstrate no dolphin mortality, no injuries, and no setting on dolphins. So that's what made this measure clearly, in the eyes of the adjudicator, a technical regulation. And I hope this has shown you how sometimes in these gray areas you really need to think hard to see exactly where you draw the line, because it is important to have that line clearly drawn. Now it's clear, pursuant to this jurisprudence, that even if you have a labeling regime that is not required to sell or to import, if it has that feature that the gentleman pointed out, then it's likely a technical regulation. So maybe let's take those two comments, and maybe also Anwar here, and then we turn to the non-discrimination part. No, please. Okay, so maybe we'll go to the back. I think maybe there was one at the very back. Thank you.
Before this clarification, actually I was of the opinion that the last part in bold would come under the purview of conformity assessment procedures. So that was my
interesting. Many professionals in the field, academics, have made a similar comment. So I think there is some truth behind that. But it was not something that transpired in the context of litigation. Thank you.
So coming to the Mexico case, so it was a ban from the US, a total ban on this tuna products without this dolphin-free mark, because we are under a ban. So if the country has fully banned, then how come the consumers can make a choice?
Yeah, no. So maybe I should have clarified that at the beginning. In the 80s, the US imposed a ban but Mexico and other international partners put pressure and engaged with the US, and that's why they turned the ban from a ban to a labeling regime. So it started as a ban and it became a labeling regime in the 90s. And the subject of this litigation was the labeling regime.
But yes, this question is, I think, about the shrimp.
Sorry?
Shrimp ban.
The shrimp. The shrimp, yeah. Yeah, for shrimp it was a ban. It was a ban unless you could show that you had turtle excluding devices, these TEDs, or equivalent effective methods.
Still under that.
Exactly. It's in place.
It's in place.
Unless you show, basically, it's in place, but you can find an exemption from the ban, which is, I think, what the complainants in that case were doing. Indonesia, Malaysia, a few others. Thailand, yeah. Anwar?
Yeah, Mateo, it ties back to what you just mentioned about turtle exclusion devices. I was hoping, maybe you have it subsequently, the element that the panel and the body later on found that this was discriminatory as well, considering that it was specifically confined only to Eastern Territorial Pacific, not to the rest of the ocean. So because I'm getting you that you touched upon it, because it is confined to a region, similarly the turtle exclusion devices is confined to waters in Southeast Asia. So can this be treated as discriminatory? You can also light on that. That would be helpful.
Thank you. So I think that's actually the perfect segue to the second and final part of this presentation, which is this question of, now we know that it's a technical regulation, so we know that we are within the scope of the agreement. Now, was the measure discriminatory? So Mexico, of course, was arguing that it was discriminatory, and in particular because it provided less favorable treatment to Mexican tuna products. Because they could not access the dolphin safe label. Why couldn't they? Because they still fished in the ETP, the Eastern Tropical Pacific, using the fishing technique of setting on dolphins. Whereas the US fishing fleet no longer used that fishing technique, and therefore its vast majority was able to access that label. So Mexico considered that the measure provided less favorable treatment. Now, here I'm going to, before we get into the specifics of where the panel and the EAB came out, I would like to do a brief parenthesis to go into some legal nitty-gritty. So you remember how yesterday we spoke so much about how the TBT agreement provides ample regulatory space to members to pursue legitimate objectives, right? So now it's clear, right? But then how do you take that into consideration when assessing a claim of discrimination? So the appellate body in this dispute, what they realized is that a holistic reading of the TBT agreement requires the adjudicator not only to look at whether a measure provides, at whether a measure has any difference in treatment between products. That's only the first step. And once you have concluded that the measure provides for a difference in treatment, in other words, the measure causes detrimental impact to imports, once you have reached that conclusion, then you have to nonetheless examine the policy objective part. And the way the appellate body framed this is you need to examine whether the detrimental impact on imports stems exclusively from a legitimate regulatory distinction. You may remember that under the GATT, this general agreement, where there are of course also non-discrimination obligations, you have a very, very important provision that grants policy space. and that's the so-called Article 20 general exception that allows WTO members to deviate from basic obligations when they are pursuing a legitimate policy objective. So that's the GATT. But here we're in the context of the TBT agreement, where there is no explicit express Article 20 general exception. So this is the avenue that the appellate body found to give members that regulatory space to actually pursue those legitimate objectives. So this basically means that the question is not only whether there is detrimental impact to imports, but you also need to assess whether there is perhaps a legitimate policy objective that explains, that justifies that detrimental impact. So I close my legal nerdy parenthesis, and we go back to the case, and we go back to that map. Now, remember how I said that most of the setting on dolphins took place in the ETP, and most of the dolphin mortalities took place in the ETP. But there is also dolphin mortality and serious injury in other parts of the ocean, even with other fishing techniques, not only with setting on dolphins, with other fishing techniques as well. So maybe something that wasn't clear at the beginning is that the measure actually regulated all the oceans, but it had these specific requirements for the Eastern Tropical Pacific of no dolphin mortality, no setting on dolphins, and that had to be certified by an independent observer. So that's what applied within the ETP, and I think this goes to basically to Anna's question about the discrimination. Outside the ETP, basically in all the other parts of the ocean, you only needed to show no dolphin mortality and no serious injury, and you did not need to have an independent observer on the boat certifying that. So those are the two main differences inside the ATP, the two requirements and the independent observer. Outside the ATP, one requirement, no mortality, and no independent observer. So Mexico, what did Mexico want? And this is why this is such an interesting case from the point of view of the protection of the environment. What did Mexico want? Mexico wanted the US law to be changed inside the ETP, right? They wanted to get rid of the no setting on dolphins requirement, because the Mexican fishing fleet used setting on dolphins, and they also wanted to get rid of the independent observer, which added cost, as the colleague pointed out. But the US, they were saying, hold on a minute, we are pursuing a legitimate policy objective, the protection of the environment, and therefore, how can we be forced to lower our environmental protection standards? And that's the question that the AB was facing. So you know, when the AB was confronted with this situation and these two very different arguments, it also examined the totality of the evidence that showed something very interesting. And we have already alluded to this, but let's go through that again. And what the AB realized was that there was also important dolphin mortality outside the ETP, where the requirements were particularly low in order to obtain the dolphin safe tuna label. So what did the AB say at the end? The AB said the following: look, United States, you as a regulating country, you can decide what your environmental objective is, you can decide how ambitious you want it to be, but there is something you need to guarantee. you need to address the risks to dolphins from fishing in a commensurate way to the different risks in different parts of the ocean. In other words, the AB realized that within the ATP, the risks, let's say, were here, and the requirements were here. But outside the ATP, the risks were here, let's say a bit lower, but the requirements were much lower. And they said that's a problem. This measure, when understood holistically, does not fully calibrate to capture properly the risks to dolphins in all parts of the ocean. So then the report came out, and then it was maybe an indication that it was a good report, because Mexico had basically received a finding of inconsistency, but they didn't like what was the reasoning for that finding of inconsistency. And the US, they had their measure found to be inconsistent, but then when they read it through, they were like, okay, now I see the logic behind it. So then they revised their law, and what did they do? They increased their requirements outside the ATP. So nowadays, the requirements outside the ATP are commensurate to the risks faced by dolphins in those parts of the ocean. So in a way, Mexico was somewhat frustrated because its fishing fleet wanted to get rid of setting on dolphins. But if one looks at this case from the point of view of the protection of the environment in an effective way, this was a very important case, because the clear winner here was the protection of the environment. Because thanks to the reasoning in the panel and the appellate body reports, the US increased those requirements outside the ATP in a way that protects dolphin populations way more than the way it was done in the original measure. So with this, I conclude this presentation about a real TBT dispute, and I think we maybe have 1 or 2 minutes for any questions or comments if there are.
Mexico has been discriminated against. Mexico.
So exactly, so Mexico was discriminated against, indeed, but there were 2 ways to comply with that finding, right? One way was to lower the requirements inside the ATP, but we know from the historical evolution of this case that environmental groups in the US would have never allowed this to happen. So the only way of complying for the US government was to increase the requirements outside the ATP. And now the measure was actually found by the appellate body not to be discriminatory, even though the Mexican fleet may be still maybe not fully happy with the results. Any other comments or questions?
Mexico has to de-associate with the tuna with the dolphin.
Exactly. Please.
I would like to understand 3 aspects here. First of all, as the appellate body is included in, so it settled through a dispute settlement. Second, how long did it take to settle this dispute? And in terms of Indian context, what our colleagues talked about the turtle issue in the shrimp, if it can be taken as STC, because the measures which are in place and the countermeasures are also available.
Thank you. I think maybe we can even take this between the 2 of us. Maybe I'll say a few things about how long it took, and then maybe Erik may want to come in on the STC part. Or I can do it as well. But basically, this dispute, WTO litigation compared to other systems of international adjudication is one of the fastest and most efficient in the world. A case before the International Court of Justice can take 15, 20 years. WTO compared to that is much, much quicker. But of course, there are still 2 levels of review: panel, which is first level, and then appellate review. And then there is the possibility of bringing what we call a compliance dispute, which is basically a dispute focusing on whether a revised measure adopted to comply with an original ruling is consistent with the agreements. So this case actually had 1 round of original review, panel and appellate review, and then 2 rounds of compliance disputes. So that basically meant that the whole thing lasted around 6 to 7 years. So it's of course many years, especially for industry. I mean, I could totally see how that can potentially be perhaps a little too long. But eventually there was a finality after the second compliance review by the appellate body concluded that the US measure was now consistent with the TBT agreement. Then on the STC's part?
Yeah, I mean, on that part, that is essentially India's decision, whether you would want to bring this to the TBT committee or not. So this dovetails well with the next session after the lunch, where we will talk about the role of the committee and what one can do in that context. But in general, India is more on the defensive than on the offensive and at the committee level. So it's something you may wish to think about, but that's really up to you. You have to think, what is the issue, what is the case, how do we bring this to WTO? But this kind of background is always helpful.
Adding to this, another effect, one spillover effect is that our shrimps are going to other markets, the wild caught shrimp. So the other markets, what they tell, look, your product is being banned from US, so we will reduce the price for your product. So we are losing the premium price in the other markets, like Japan, Vietnam and all, EU also. So because of this US ban, our product is getting less price in the other markets.
Interesting, and maybe just to see if I understand in full, currently the Indian fishing fleet is able to use turtle excluding devices?
We are implementing that. We are in the process of implementing.
Okay. So maybe, even maybe by one of the organizers, I'll be happy to share those original findings from the US shrimp turtles dispute from the 90s, because I think they may shed light for you in terms of maybe the process you need to follow, because basically, just to tell a long story short, in that dispute, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia complained because they were also facing this ban. And basically the end result was that the US was told, look, you can have a ban to protect turtles that may die when fishing for shrimp, but you cannot do so by imposing a uniform single standard that is only suitable to the US. You need to be open to other methods. Simply ensure that they are equally effective. And if they are equally effective, you need to also grant them access. So I think this is maybe the avenue that the Indian industry may wish to follow and potentially is following. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for your attention and your questions and interesting comments. Bon appetit.
I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for the very insightful session. I